Hi, it's Charlton. The best way to listen to this season of Sounds Current is in order. So if you haven't heard it already, please go back and start with episode 1, A Haunting History, and then meet us right back here when you're finished. We also want to let you know that this episode contains brief, graphic mentions of suicide, so please take care while listening.
Oh, there's a hummingbird. Oh, that little chirp, that loud chirp. And there is a great blue heron. Oh, wow.
This is Casey Dexter Lee. Casey is a state park interpreter at Angel Island State Park.
It's too bad we couldn't have a beautifully idyllic sunny day with puffy white clouds for you. Oh, wait, we did.
Casey's role at the park includes educating staff and volunteers and leading educational programs on all recreational, natural, and cultural aspects of the island. Casey has actually lived on the island for over 20 years, and she's often the go-to for questions about everything from what to do during a brownout to where are all the fire extinguishers. Internet service is spotty there, so rather than attempting a remote interview, Del Sol violinist Hei Young took a trip via ferry to record with Casey on location.
Yeah, so I'm on Angel Island right now, so you might even hear some of the sounds of Angel Island in the background. There's some birds squawking and chirping, there's ravens and jays, and you might hear the waves lapping at the beaches. It is a real island, so to get here you have to get on a boat. Most folks take the ferry either from San Francisco or Tiburon, so you're kind of leaving behind those big city noises. It gives you a moment to transition to this different space. Even though we're in the middle of San Francisco Bay, it is a very different sound atmosphere here. Actually, as I'm looking out over the water, I just saw harbor porpoise come up for a breath. So you're definitely going to see some wildlife and nature, but it's actually part of the contrast of the place too, right? That beautiful setting and this really tough story.
In this episode of Sounds Current, we want to invite you into the world of Angel Island, both what it's like now and what it may have been like for those who landed here after leaving everything behind in search of a better life.
Historically, the immigration station had its own dock, so ferries would have come directly here, but that dock isn't here anymore. So when you walk into the site, you're almost coming in the back way. So we really encourage people, if they have the time, to walk down to the water and then come back into the site that way so that you kind of mimic the arrival experience of people that were detained here. And it kind of gives you some time to kind of leave what you came with behind and kind of focus in on the experience here. So the Detention Barracks Museum today, they're wooden structures here for the most part, which is surrounded by a chain link fence with barbed wire at the top. There's also kind of a chain mesh over all of the windows. So even though it's this very idyllic and beautiful setting, it is a detention facility. That was what it was built to do.
Inside the detention center barracks, Casey says the smaller rooms were healthy for 25 to 30 people, but instead had bunks stacked 3 high for twice that many, while larger rooms that were healthy for 50 often held up to 200 people at a time.
So there's 3 levels of bunk beds. They're metal and they're connected to poles that go from floor to ceiling. So you would potentially be sleeping right next to someone that you don't know. And the beds are smaller than a twin bed. They're just under 6 feet, probably 5.5 feet in length and maybe 3 feet wide. There's no ladders or anything. You actually step on the beds below you to get up to the upper bunks. Immigrants sometimes would tie strings between the poles above the beds to dry their laundry. You would wash in a sink in the bathroom. Initially, there were actually chandeliers in some of the rooms, and people were hanging laundry on that, so they removed the chandeliers to prevent fires.
Though the administration building was destroyed by fire in 1940, the barracks have been preserved and restored in order to give visitors a sense of what living here was like. The rest of their conversation was recorded inside.
So, can you tell us the story about Alexander Weiss's role?
You may remember mention of Alexander Weiss, the park ranger often credited with the discovery of the poetry carved on the walls from episode 1. Here's the real story.
So Alexander Weiss was a ranger here at Angel Island State Park, and he and other staff that were here, went inside of the 120 or so historic structures that are here in the park and saw writing on the walls. He wasn't the only one to see that writing, but he was the only one that kind of went outside of the park to talk about it.
Alexander Weiss himself was a Jewish refugee from Austria whose immediate family managed to escape the Nazis during World War II when he was just 2 or 3 years old.
So perhaps felt some sort of connection to the people that came through here. And he had been a freedom rider in the South, and he was a poet. He'd been a zookeeper at the San Francisco Zoo. He has a poem about being scratched by a tiger. So just a really interesting character. And he was taking some classes at San Francisco State. So he was connected with a professor there who started bringing out these kind of informal field trips with students from the college. And that was the seed to what is now our nonprofit called the Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation. So that original historic advisory committee they formed was a really vital step in the preservation of the building, because California State Parks' plan for the structures here was to destroy them. And so they were going to create, they being us, I work for State Parks, we were going to create camping and picnicking on this north side of the island. And those students and teachers wanted the buildings to be saved. And the poems on the walls actually saved the building from being destroyed. It's a really rare opportunity to hear from people in the past that weren't winning the story, right? We talk about history being written by the winners. I think it's very easy to, see that the people detained here were not winning in that moment. For their voices to be the dominant voice of this history is just something that's very unusual.
From the Sol Quartet, this is Sounds Current, Angel Island. I'm Charlton Lee.
We definitely know that for many of the people who experienced detention on Angel Island, that experience was so traumatic that they never talked about it with their family, with their children, with their grandchildren.
You'll remember Ed Taborn from episode 1. Ed is the executive director of the Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation.
And it wasn't until these individuals passed away that their family members might learn that their grandfather, their grandmother had come through Angel Island.
Over the years, descendants of those who may have been detained on Angel Island often come with the hope of filling in the blanks of their family story. Though records are not kept on the island, many can be found in the National Archives in San Bruno at archives.gov.
The oral histories that we've collected over the past 10 years point to the experience of detention being very unpleasant. Imagine if you had no idea how long you're going to be stuck and confined in this building. It could be days, it could be weeks, it could be months. And you were only allowed outside for maybe half an hour to an hour a day. So imagine that you are in this wooden structure that's very drafty. We know the Bay Area can get very cold. You were eating food that was not restaurant quality food. There's actually several poems that talk about the poor quality of the food.
I mean, on top of the food being low quality, it's also, I would imagine for most of these immigrants, a foreign food. Foods that they had never eaten before or prepared in ways that they were completely unfamiliar with, which made it far worse.
Right. We also know that the immigration officials spent more money on the food for European immigrants versus the food for Asian immigrants. So that's just another example of the disparate treatment of Asian immigrants versus European immigrants at Angel Island.
Yeah, I saw on the hospital building basically segregated entrances even into the building, you know.
Exactly. There were multiple layers of segregation that happened at Angel Island the moment that you stepped foot on the island. So Europeans were segregated from the Asians. The Chinese were actually separated from other Asians. Men and women were separated from each other. And so if I were a boy traveling with my mom and I was over the age of 12 years old, she would have been put in the part of the station that was for women and girls, and I would have been put in the part of the station that was for men and boys, and we would not have had contact with one another. And then the individuals who were deemed healthy versus those who were unhealthy were also separated from each other.
One of the things that I would say is that when I came up to you and said, you know, I was an Angel Island descendant, that was about the extent of what I knew.
This is Andy Wong, who you will also remember from episode 1, educator and collaborator on the Angel Island project.
I didn't really know anything about the specifics other than I knew that my father, his mother, my grandmother, my Yin, well, she was pregnant on Angel Island. And the family story was she had to be let off the island to have my dad. And then after she gave birth, she had to bring him back to the island to prove that she gave birth. So that was about all that we knew. And in the course of working with you and really thinking about how would we tackle this history and be sensitive about it, I figured I was like my own guinea pig. I was really grateful that you called Grant Dinn, who had worked with the immigration station, really awesome genealogist and researcher. And when we called him and had him take us out to Angel Island, give the tour, he said to me afterwards, you know, do you want me to go find your transcripts? And so he did. He found the transcripts not only for my grandmother, but also for my husband's father.
Andy's referring to the transcripts from the special boards of inquiry that Ed described in the last episode. They were basically interrogations that would determine whether a detainee would eventually be granted access to the United States or be turned back.
And my husband's father, on the papers it says he was 9. He was very small, so he could pass as a 9-year-old, but he was really 12, or so he told us. But what we found out through Grant, he came back and said, "Oh, your grandmother's story is really interesting. In the ship ride over, she contracted a case of hookworm. It wasn't a good thing to come over and to have a disease. That would be like a real reason to send you away." So what happened was, because she was 5 months pregnant, they couldn't treat her. And what we found out was that my grandfather in 1929 had to come up with $1,000 bail to get my grandmother off the island. It raised a really big question, like, how did he do it? He was a butcher, a merchant. It also brought up the collaborative nature of the community, that they would support each other and kind of put their money into a pot. So I think, you know, that's probably what happened. I'll never really know, but that would be my guess.
Right. I remember trying to calculate a little bit how much that would have been in today's dollars, like $30,000 or more.
Right. Yeah, it's crazy.
It's a lot.
And so I wondered, well, what would have happened if he couldn't come up with the money? Would they have sent her back? And if you're 5 months pregnant, you know, and you've made it all this way and you're sick, what would happen? So I feel very lucky that, you know, I can explore the story.
How well did you know your grandparents?
I have 2 sides of my family. One side is my father's mom, who was held on Angel Island. And the other side of my family goes all the way back to the railroad. My great-great-grandfather is one of the few people that there's actually written proof that he worked on the railroad. My grandmother on my dad's side never spoke English. Yeah, it was always a challenge as a kid to navigate, well, what is grandma saying? And what does she want? And my grandparents spoke 2 different dialects of Chinese. And so I never learned either because both of them were wrong. I took a little bit of Mandarin in college, and my grandmother was like, "Why are you doing that?" You know. So I'm a 5th generation born Chinese American Californian, which that was really interesting to find out that there are people who don't really even believe that somebody like me would exist.
And how old were you when you learned about these transcripts?
60? Yeah, I was 60.
Did reading these transcripts change your perception of who your grandparents and your father-in-law were?
Oh, yeah, of course, because when you read those transcripts and you see the questioning, you just go, okay, she came, she was pregnant, probably nauseated, she had a case of hookworm, and they put her in detention. They didn't treat her. They bombarded her with questions like, which river did you come by? How many steps did you take in order to catch you in a mess up? When did your husband see you last? What was he wearing?
In fact, detainees would be asked hundreds of questions, and interrogation could last for days.
You know, thinking about my grandmother answering those questions, and she doesn't speak the language. You know, it's like the first thing that happens to her when she comes to a country. She can't even go with her husband. And with my father-in-law, you know, seeing the questioning that he endured as a young man, you know, it's heartbreaking to me because on the transcripts, he can't even sign his name. He just does a little X. And to have him actually be able to say to us, this place was horrid. We actually brought him to Angel Island thinking, oh, you know, this will be so great. We'll bring Dad to Angel Island and he'll tell us all about it. And I'd never heard him swear in his life. And that day he dropped the F-bomb. He was just like, why are you bringing me back here? And whether it had gotten worse in his memory or if it truly was that bad, he told us of seeing a woman hang herself in the bathroom, you know, and these are things that no child should see. So, yeah, it teaches you a whole different way to see them. Yeah.
How early did you get there, Jenny?
Shortly after 70, maybe it was 72. So yeah, really early on. And at that time, nobody even knew about it except for a few of us that worked at East West News.
This is poet and Angel Island Project collaborator Jenny Lim.
And I went out on the staff boat with Paul Chow. He was kind of like a volunteer docent, and he was so impassioned about the story. And then sometimes the Chinese Historical Society people were a little upset because he had a tendency to really dramatize. You know, and who's to say if he was exaggerating or not, but they thought he over-embellished many of the stories. I went out with him and we went through the barracks and I was like stunned. It was like nothing was there. It was just the dingy barracks. We looked at all the carvings that we could see, and he was running around going in the crawl space or under the barrack and pulled out this old metal, like a box spring old mattress that was, I don't know where it came from, why it was there. I think I was like in a state of shock while he was babbling away about, oh, this is where they hung themselves, you know, in the lavatory. And he would say how they were made to run the gauntlet to the bathroom because they were so scared, you know, of the ghosts. But it was true, especially the women. They were really afraid to go. They had to be escorted to go to the bathroom at night because they really believed that the ghosts of the former detainees, the women, had committed suicide. There was that one story where this woman was going to be deported and she was bringing over 2 sons, and they told her she wasn't going to land. She sharpened a chopstick and pierced her ear to her brain and died. Well, it was such a scandal that the immigration decided to land the 2 sons ASAP after that. And that was the worst of the stories, but that one really shook me. I mean, to be pushed to that extent where you would do something that desperate because you just couldn't go back home. Most of the suicides happened on the ships going back, but it's a very, very depressing, sad chapter. My father was very upset when he found out that we were interviewing my mother. He didn't want to have anything to do with it. Actually, I had to tell Judy and Mark that we had to confiscate my mother's oral history because he didn't want her to be a part of it.
Jenny is referring to the book she edited along with Judy Young and him Mark Lai, Island, Poetry and History of Chinese Immigrants on Angel Island, 1910 to 1940.
But then, the scuttlebutt in the community went around and that people were coming forward and doing the interviews, and it reached even his gongsa. The males in the Lim Family Association knew about what we were doing, and ultimately they felt that was an important history. And then I think he changed his perspective about it. And then he realized that there wasn't anything to fear, even though there was never an amnesty. He just didn't trust the U.S. government.
In 1957, the U.S. government launched the Chinese Confession Program, dangling the carrot of legal status or even citizenship to those who would confess to illegal entry. But it really wasn't that straightforward.
I mean, there was an uproar during the confessional program, and when people started coming forward and confessing that they were paper sons or daughters.
Paper sons and daughters are people who attempted to enter the U.S. as family members of existing Chinese American citizens. They were sons and daughters on paper only.
Because it implicated all the all their relatives and family members. So it's okay for you to confess, but what about us? We didn't give you permission. So it really polarized the community.
To me, it's crazy how close the history is. It's often painted as if it was really far in the past. We really don't know the impact of an event until you have a chance to get some distance on it. And so for me, exploring all of this really explained a lot of things that maybe I sensed about my family, but didn't really know until you start digging, right? And then you also have to be careful that you're going to touch on a nerve. So it's been really an amazing journey.
Given the complexity of these stories, how could we, as a string quartet, honor the past while creating something that feels meaningful now?
Charlton had known about the story of Angel Island and the poetry that was left behind, but we knew that it was going to be a massive project.
Besides being our cellist, Catherine wears many hats in the Sol Quartet. Not least of them is that of grant writer.
We were kind of sitting on the idea for a while, and in January of 2017, all of a sudden there was this unexpected opportunity from the Bay Area-based Hewlett Foundation, and they announced for their 50th anniversary they were going to do 50 commissions, 10 commissions over 5 years in 5 different disciplines. And so we went ahead and put in a letter of inquiry in April, and we're very thrilled to receive the invitation to submit a full application, which was going to be due in August. Now, the trick with this was I was co-curating the Festival of Contemporary Music at Tanglewood in 2017 in August. And we were still madly putting together the larger scale application. And I show up in the Berkshires, and we are staying at the composer's cottage, and there is no internet. And so every day after rehearsals and all of my obligations as curator and coach, we would go sit in the attic of the carriage house on the grounds of Tanglewood property until, I'm not sure if they ever did kick us out, but until the wee hours of the morning, sitting in this little attic, working on the little Tanglewood computer. And Huang Ro was actually there as well. And we pulled together this application literally in the wee hours of the morning at the top of this, little carriage house at Tanglewood. And we sent it off into the ether, and we got the call that we had gotten this grant to do this project. And I think those humble beginnings and those nights when you think, is this all going to be worth it? It really just gave us the fire and gave us the ability to pull off such a large, and now probably the most important project of Del Sol's sort of commissioning history, I would say.
Oh no, that sounds terrible.
It was really, we were like, I hope this is worthwhile. And we knew it was a long shot because we figured like everybody was going to be applying for this.
So sorry to hear that our application process really took away from your artistic experience at Tanglewood of all places.
This is Emiko Ono, director of the Performing Arts program at the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation.
So the Hewlett Foundation invests really in creative thinkers who are working to ensure everyone has a meaningful opportunity to thrive. It was established in 1966 by the engineer and entrepreneur Bill Hewlett, his wife Flora, and their son Walter. And the foundation works in a couple of focus areas that are very critical to our society. Those include education, climate change, and gender equity, for example.
The Hewlett 50 Arts Commissions was created in 2016 to mark the 50th anniversary of the foundation. The idea was to support the creation of 50 major new works from world-class artists that would premiere in the Bay Area. We were incredibly fortunate to be among those selected.
I remember the proposal. I wasn't in the room when it was reviewed. It was actually a group of very well-established musicians, musicologists, academics, practitioners, composers from all across the country. They flew in, and Del Sol's proposal was right at the top of the list. There were several things about the project that were very compelling to the group. You know, it was the composer, Wang Ro, is a visionary artist with a very mature and important voice. You know, he has a record of just having an incredible level of control over different elements of his work. And he completed so many operas even by then, and had been executing major premieres for more than a decade. And it wasn't just the composer themselves, right, that had to be good. There really had to be a very complementary partner that was working with them, and that's where Del Sol comes in. And the thing that I remember this group talking about is that Del Sol is always up for anything. You laugh, maybe. You know, you've collaborated with so many different artists from so many different backgrounds, different tuning systems and playing techniques. And that sort of willingness to try anything, but also long history of collaborating with artists and being able to bring out the best in artists and bring what Del Sol has to offer, that amalgam of things, that was really exciting to the panel that reviewed.
Oh, I think we should hire you as our publicity person.
I'm just saying back to you what happened. The work that Del Sol's doing in Angel Island Oratorio is the reason I do this work. I've learned my own history by being able to experience these pieces of work, being with artists, being in my own Japanese American community, and listen to elders who learned how to be brave through the arts, learned how to stand up and tell their story even when it was really dangerous. And I've been able to piece together my own history that way. So it's a deeply personal thing that draws me into the arts. But I also think about it from a cultural landscape perspective, which is to think about what are the many ways that cultural hierarchy is playing out in society and whose stories are and aren't being told. And how can the arts be part of restoring that fabric, or at least making it a little more even?
As far as the history of Angel Island, I do remember learning one paragraph about Chinese exclusion when I was in high school.
This is Casey on the island with Hae-young.
Unfortunately, the only reason I really remember it is because someone in my class made an inappropriate comment. And so I was really offended and felt defensive. I do have family members that have some Chinese ancestry, so I was, coming to the defense of my cousins. And, as a 17-year-old, that was kind of my first hint at the history I would end up telling for most of my career. If you're old enough to remember being here, you were probably born about 1930. So those folks are 93, if that is math. And there's some that are a little younger, but they might not remember being here. But it's a group that won't be here very much longer. But, we also recognize not everyone wants to talk about this, and that's okay too. It's hard. When I first started, there was a volunteer here who had been detained here as a teenager, Dale Ching, and he and his wife would come out every Thursday, and he would lead tours for kids on school field trips. And he was someone that did not want to come back here ever. He didn't want to talk about it. And his kids and grandkids got him to come out. When I tell the story, I say, I honestly don't know if they told him where he was going before or after they got on the ferry, but because he had no interest in coming out here. And they kind of followed another group that was getting a tour around, and he talked to some of the kids about their tour, and they were very excited about the ferry ride and maybe not so excited about the history. And that's when he decided to become a docent and start leading tours himself, because he knew how important it was that people understand this story better. And he would show the kids where his bed was. And, that's hugely powerful, right? When you start talking about the history of the Chinese exclusion law in 1882 and the gold rush, for kids, this is so long ago. But when you have someone standing in front of you and say, this happened to me, that makes it so much more real.
Here's Emiko.
My grandmother was a picture bride.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, God. So did she come through Hawaii or?
They came originally to Seattle, so I'm not sure where they actually came through.
Okay.
But 1924.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. What Angel Island Oratorio did for me was to then get into that frame of mind to understand what it's like to leave a home and to have these people show up and to be incarcerated, and the level of despair, the callous system, the potential that was stolen, the happiness that was stolen. It's all in that poetry. It's all in that libretto.
Yeah. I mean, just a number of stories we got, maybe not firsthand, but secondhand, from the people talking about their parents or the stories that their parents told them. Mm-hmm. And the last Hoisan poets that we were working with. We're referring to Nellie Wong and Flo Oi Wong, who perform as the last Hoisan poets along with Jenny Lim. They grew up having to call their mother their auntie because you weren't allowed to bring wives. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so she had to come in as the sister. But then, of course, then if she's having kids, she had to marry somebody else in order to make it look legitimate. I was like, all this craziness.
Yeah. And some of those secrets were never explained.
Right. Oh, yeah. It was traumatic, it was embarrassing, it was shameful or whatnot, and they just wanted to bury it. I think a lot of the older generation was just like, they could deport me still because I'm illegal. Mm-hmm. And technically to this day, there actually is no amnesty for that. And so we're still dealing with that.
But this piece, just as it was for Andy to discover her history, it only happens because of works like this. And it doesn't require you to be intimately involved in the creation of it. To be able to have these small, informal, but life-changing, conversations. And they're not life-changing like, oh, my life's going in different directions. Like, oh, I understand myself. I understand, when I went to Heart Mountain and I saw my father in that space, I understood him so much better in a flash.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
You went with him.
I did. I was really fortunate to be able to go with him. But there's these stories that are still in us that we don't share, And it doesn't mean we have to have a direct connection to that place. It can be a different immigrant story, a vastly different one.
Right.
But it invites a conversation.
How do you find the strength and the fortitude to delve into this story when it's so deeply personal and has so much pain associated with it?
It's a really hard question.
Here's Jenny.
I don't usually respond that consciously or premeditatedly to my creative process. It's sort of something that's always buried in my subconscious, and it comes out, in different ways in the way I interact socially with people. For many years, I had real difficulty interacting with Caucasians, with white people. I felt very uncomfortable. I didn't know what to say to them. I didn't know how to socialize with them. Am I being over friendly or am I being dorky, because, there was always this distance. And so I think I'm processing a lot of the trauma that my family felt and the transference of that trauma of my father, especially my father, to me. So there was an interview that Toni Morrison gave where she talked about how her father, lost his temper, completely lost it on some white guy, just the way he was treated. And I remember an incident when my father, who I loved so much and was so proud of, I worshiped him. We had a really close relationship. He was a contractor for Fritzi's of California, a label that makes women's garments. And he had to get all these boxes of blouses shipped on time. And when he wasn't on time with his shipments, she just gave him hell. But one day I was standing right with my father and she says, "Mr. Lamb, if you don't, and she was just yelling at him up and down and all around and says, "I will just give it to someone else," All he did was he sat with his, stood there with his head hung and he was just, yes, Missy Mildred, yes, ma'am. You can't talk back. I was mortified. And I think that experience, really alienated me from, white society, white culture. Oh, this is how they're going to always treat me. So when I tell my stories, it's so personal and private to me. That's why I've never written a memoir. I always feel like it's, kind of a betrayal of trust because my father was so private. Just sharing the Angel Island story with the public was like a betrayal to him. So I'm always fearful of that, letting the whites know too much about me, too much about us. So always kind of keep my cards close to my chest. And that's always kind of been what you call maybe a little chip on my shoulder, trying to heal that and reconcile with that by taking these stories and transforming them into self-healing for myself and for members of my community that they're still processing that genetic trauma, that memory that gets transferred and passed on generation after generation. So it's really important for us as artists to be honest and not try to harp on the negativity, to always kind of reiterate our, sob stories okay, I've heard enough about the camps. Can't you write about something else? I've heard enough about Angel Island. If there's a truth that has yet to be told, it needs to be told. That's all.
It's funny, I was always embarrassed by my dad for just the opposite. He was incredibly outspoken. So I was like, oh, just. But he was
that sounds like my dad.
He'd be like, all right, if there's something going on, he'd be in their face and just telling them. So
Yeah.
Here's Andy.
I think for me, learning about trauma and how it impacts people it's very interesting to me because I've had my share of personal trauma. And what it made me realize is how little we know about how we process. I had an incident where it was an act of violence that I experienced. And so it was really interesting because on some levels, it thrust me into things that I never would have done. So I'm a reluctant traveler, but I travel.
Next time on Sounds Current, a world premiere, some singing sergeants, and a trip around the world. But none of it goes the way we expect. The Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation invites you to learn more about Immigrant Voices, a growing archive of personal stories of immigrants to the Pacific Coast. You can explore collected stories or submit your own at aiisf.org. Featured music in this episode is by Teresa Wong, Ken Ueno, Timo Chen, Taylor Ho Bynum, Erica Oba, Byron O. Yong, and Jung-Yoon Wee. Sounds Current is a production of the Del Sol Quartet and the Del Sol Performing Arts Organization. Del Sol is Catherine Bates, Benjamin Creeth, Haeyoung So-yoon, and me, Charlton Lee. This podcast is produced and edited by Andrea Klunder at the Creative Imposter Studios. Technical direction and post-production audio by Edwin R. Ruiz. Additional production support from Alex Riegler. Show notes by Lisa Witter. Cover art by Felicia Lee. Our theme music was composed by me and performed by Del Sol Quartet. Angel Island was composed by Huang Ruo with generous funding from the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, with additional funding from the Phyllis C. Wattis Foundation and the Clarence E. Heller Charitable Foundation. Special thanks to Andrea Fellows-Feinberg and Don Feinberg, who believe our stories are worth sharing. And thank you to all of our guests and collaborators in the ever-expanding world of Angel Island. You can find links to all of the resources and partners mentioned in this episode in the show notes in the episode description in your app and at delsolquartet.com/podcast. To learn more about Del Sol Quartet and the Angel Island Project, visit delsolquartet.com.